Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, Damien Sojoyner returns to the podcast to talk about his first book, First Strike: Educational Enclosures in Black Los Angeles. This episode was recorded back in November, and unfortunately its release has been delayed due to the circumstances of the world today, which have necessitated for us a lot of media work in solidarity with Palestinian resistance and against the genocide being enacted on Palestinians most visibly and egregiously in Gaza. Most of that work, of course, can be found on our YouTube channel. I also had the chance to catch up with Damien Sojoyner recently at the Archives Unbound conference at UC Santa Barbara. And you can check out a brief interview I conducted with him and Shauna Redman in a recent live stream that I will link in the show notes as well. This book, First Strike, is one that I had been wanting to discuss with Damien since I first learned of it, because it very much relates to various intersecting interests of mine: the Black radical tradition, abolition, the prison industrial complex, and public education. Disrupting common framing of a school-to-prison pipeline, Sojoyner really examines how we might understand public schools and different regimes of education as enclosures upon more radical possibilities. And we get into a discussion of the warehousing function of schools, the psychological warfare aspects of it, and more. As there is a lot of connection between this discussion and the one we had with Damien last year on his book, Against the Carceral Archive, we have also linked that in the show notes. We will have more audio content for you by the end of the month, as well as another episode on the YouTube channel later this week. There is a playlist from the Cedric Robinson and Elizabeth Robinson Archives Unbound Conference. It includes interviews with, as I already mentioned, Damien Sojoyner, Shauna Redman, Stephen Osuna, Arun Kudnani, and most recently, HLT Kwan. If you appreciate the work we do at Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, the best way you can support our work is, as always, to become a patron of the show. We are still working to find better solutions to getting all of the audio content we have backlogged released to you as quickly as possible. This has meant paying for some additional help in many cases. All that is to say, we appreciate all of you who have been contributing to our work, some of you for many years now. If people listening are not patrons of the show yet and are able to give $1 a month or more, that is deeply appreciated as well. You can do that at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. All right, so Damien Sojoyner, welcome back. Happy to have you again on the pod. We had you on earlier this year to talk about your book, Against the Carceral Archive. And after, in that discussion, we talked a little bit just tangentially about this book, I think, just because that book kind of in some ways picks up in certain ways from where this book leaves off. I mean, in that book, you're actually looking at, in certain ways, alternative forms of education and, thinking about the work of the Southern California Library and things like that. And afterward, I started to look into this more and looked at some of the talks you'd given on it and said, yeah, let's do a conversation on this book. And so before we get into it, maybe just talk a little bit about what drew you to write this book project. There's some great influences in it that, people that you acknowledge and talk about throughout or cite throughout. Your mother, Clyde Woods, Cedric Robinson, Beth Ritchie, Mike Davis is heavily cited here. I'm just interested in thinking about, your influences to either write this or, some of the influence maybe of some of those folks on this. But what drew you to this project and kind of, influenced you in examining the phenomena you're looking at in First Strike?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation back to be on the podcast. I really appreciate it. As I stated before, I'm a huge fan of the podcast and the work that you all do, and in particular, the work that you guys have been doing around the invasion of Palestine has just been fantastic. So thank you for even making time, because I know it's a lot going on right now. And with respect to the question, I would say there were several different influences that drew me to the project. One is from a personal perspective and sort of as an anecdote. is that as I proceeded through my own personal educational experience, I noticed that each level got increasingly more surveilled and closed upon, to where the point, when I graduated from high school, there was multiple layers of formal police, there was campus safety officers, and also county representative as well. In addition, there was the literal enclosure upon the school in the physical form. There's a giant fence around the school, and there's barbed wire on top of the fence as well, right? Now, for many, this is not new. And in fact, this is the norm. And as I mentioned in the book, that was pretty much how I understood education to be until we went on this one field trip up in this area called Palos Verdes. And we're sort of, we're approaching in the bus what I thought was a park. And I saw a bunch of kids. I thought that was weird. It's a school day, but all these kids were like, okay, whatever, maybe they don't have school on this day. And then I'm looking for the sign to see what park it is, and I find out it's a school. And it sort of blows my mind that I see this freedom of movement of all these kids. These are mostly all white kids who are just moving in and out of the school. There's no fences or nothing. And I was like, wow, that is pretty amazing. Didn't think much of it at the time other than that, and sort of just let that be. But that sort of memory and that thought resonated with me as I proceeded throughout my educational sort of journey. I think the second influence, maybe not the right word, but we'll roll with that, is during this time period. So we're talking about like the 1990s through the early 2000s. One of the most pervasive sort of slogans to describe what was happening within the Black community, in particular with Black men, was this notion of the endangered species model. And this, of course, was tied to the rapid expansion of the prison system in conjunction with the multiple forms of violence that were going on within neighborhoods. And, these forms of violence were taking place in large part because, aside from the military apparatus in the form of the police, the state had pretty much abandoned Black communities. And so there was a dearth of resources such as healthcare, housing support, and access to like basics such as food. And one of the more vile aspects of the endangered species models was that it placed the locus of blame for the abandonment and also the forms of violence enacted by the police upon aspects of personal responsibility of Black men who were Black boys who didn't know how to be mentored properly or weren't mentored properly by Black men who in turn didn't have the proper guidance and aspects of leadership, so on and so forth, right? So I don't need to rehearse and recite that because I think your audience is pretty well versed in that. But what you have is this confluence of this conversation around endangered species with prisons and education, in particular because there was a big emphasis on, well, why are Black girls doing so well in school and why aren't Black boys doing so well in school, right? And this was tied to, well, Black boys are becoming criminal and then they're getting caught up in going to jail and prison, and Black girls are just like hitting it hard, they're focused, and they're really taking their time, right? This, in many ways, was problematic from the jump, right? But for me, one of the most profound ways in which it was troubling was this idea of this myth around personal responsibility being at the core of this difference somehow between Black boys and Black girls. And so in the book, one of my attempts is to tease out that the fallacy of those myths on one hand, but then also get into what work is done by putting so much agency upon personal responsibility and how that myth-making apparatus actually took place. So then another influence as well is looking at these other sort of slogans and catchphrases, such as the school to prison pipeline, which sort of follows right on the heels of, or maybe in conjunction in some respects, with the endangered Black species sort of argument. So that slogan, was first made popular in the 1980s. Well, not even popular, it was first used in the 1980s by activists who were seeing what was happening with the buildup of the carceral state. And as sort of like a forewarning, had begun to talk about this dynamic between schools and prisons as being one of a pipeline. This then gets co-opted in the early 2000s by academics and federal and state governments as well. And so the basic formulation as it gets sort of known from 2001 until the current time is you take rates of detention, suspensions, and expulsions for Black students primarily, and then you look to see how those rates correlate to who's in prison. And the easiest way to do this is you have like a survey of people in prison and you ask them, were you suspended, expelled, or detained? And then this makes these connections between schools and prisons, right? However, this becomes one of the, it's a well-intentioned, well-meaned sort of platform of looking at schools and prisons. However, what it does is that it also creates a dynamic where schools are looked at as being these sites of utopic sort of reckoning and understanding and vision making. And so the solutions, of course, were then to say, well, we need to, if we can just sort of trim around the edges and cut back on how Black students are being disciplined through formations of suspension, detention, and expulsion, then we can make schools once again what they were. And we, at the same time, we can dramatically reduce the number of people who are in prison. So what I found in my experience was that, I knew a whole bunch of people who were suspended, detained, or expelled and never went to prison or jail at all, right? So how does that correlate with their experience, right? I also knew a bunch of people who went to jail or prison who never were suspended, detained, or expelled, right? So just on as an anecdotal level, it didn't work with me in that regard. But I think also what became quite evident was that as school districts became very sensitive, and these are major urban areas that were targeted, LA, New York, Chicago. As school districts became very sensitive to how they were being depicted as being overly zealous to discipline and punish Black youth, they then, as a way to curb these rates, began to host everything within the school, so that instead of suspending a kid for 3 or 4 days and kicking them out of school during that time period, they would just have it called like an in-house suspension. And so the student would just have to go to this room for the whole day, do some mundane quote unquote pack of learning, and just be stuck inside of a classroom for the whole day, an empty, cold classroom for the whole day. And so those rates then aren't tracked in the same way. And then schools become de facto sites of warehousing. And I should add, like, maybe another layer of warehousing, because they had already become that prior to this in the first place. So my goal was then to flesh out, well, what is this dynamic between schools and prisons? And in some ways, do schools sort of inform how prisons operate and are built? That's the technologies of control that we associate with prisons. Were they in place in schools prior? And that thought more or less sort of was in the back of my mind, because I was already quite aware that the history of Black education in this country comes directly from Native education and Indian schools. And the history of those schools is quite violent, is quite, what's the word? I guess violent is the word, right? It was a violent
colonial
enterprise.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this is, prior to the rise of what we now understand to be the carceral state. So, I was thinking, like, there's something else that's at play that's going on here right now. And then the last influence was that I knew from my personal family history in LA that schools and high schools in particular were key to organizing efforts for radical sort of organizing groups such as the Black Panther Party, right? And that schools were central for both the recruiting process, but then also central for sites of Black traditions getting passed down from one generation to the next. What I didn't know until I started just doing some of the archival work, like at the Southern California Library, was the extent to which the city went to suppress those traditions from getting passed down, and also that recruiting process with the heavy arm of the state. So this became very sort of informative with respect to the narrative of the school to prison pipeline itself, reified, as I mentioned before, this utopic vision of school, but it also was erasing the actual lived experiences of Black people, in particular in LA, from what had happened generations prior. I think what became even more revolting, and this ties back to the personal responsibility aspect, is the solution that was developed to ultimately fix the school to prison pipeline was a bastardization of restorative justice that was then put within schools. And this pretty much wholeheartedly placed the locus of responsibility back on Black youth themselves. So before you could, let's say something happened at school, let's say you yelled at a teacher or something, went down, or you were just being yourself, right? And something happened, you would have to then go before some sort of committee that the school developed and say, these were my faults, this is where I messed up, and this is how I'm going to work to do it better. And as a small anecdote, one of the more ridiculous forms of this is, and I wish I had the exact title, but on YouTube, there's a hearing before the LA City Council about restorative justice. And it's from a charter school. As a matter of fact, we were talking about this before we started recording. And there was a young black boy who was up there, and he was talking about the benefits of restorative justice and how it saved his life and saved his path. And he went on to say all the things that he had done wrong and how he had taken responsibility for those issues. And then now he's on the sort of straight and narrow. And as you listen to all the things you've done wrong, you're like, you didn't do anything wrong. Like, there was nothing here. Like, I don't get it. I don't understand what is happening, at all. It didn't make any sense, right? And so the notion of being accountable for oneself as a solution to these very pernicious forms of racial capitalist exploitative projects was just beyond absurd to me. And it was something that I felt needed to be teased out and explained. And I was hoping, my end hope was that the book would be beneficial both for organizers who were doing work around issues of the school to prison pipeline, also for teachers, because as I mentioned before, my mom was a big influence. My mom taught for over 35 years, and for a larger sort of audience of those who are interested in issues around the carceral state, to see these connections that were happening between and among prisons and schools, and why education needed to be looked at alongside the rise of the carceral state, because in many ways, as a structure, education greatly informs how we understand the need for the carceral state as well.
Yeah. It's a great book for that. And as you're talking, like, it brings up so many things for me, even just in that little bit. I can't remember. There was a thing on Twitter at one point. I don't even remember where I saw this, but it was somebody just talking. It was an image of a prison, of the inside of a prison, of a pod, basically. And somebody said something along the lines of, like, now I'm going to mess it up. But basically what was said was that, like, yeah, the first time I saw a place like this was when I went to my middle school, and it was somebody making a lot of the connection that you make in the book, which is just that these schools are already have these politics of enclosure, and they already have these carceral structures to them, and not just the structures, but also the ways that, students are expected. I mean, even that discussion as you talk about personal responsibility, I mean, that is the bullshit that people are taught in prison all the time too, of like, you have to do all these groups. And then we did a conversation with Calvin John Smiley this summer talking about re-entry. And he talked about how, people who would be in those programs with him, because he was a teacher in those programs as part of his, PhD or whatever, would say, Smiley, I'm grouped out. Like, how much of this self-help shit basically do you want me to read?
Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, as I mentioned to you off the air, I mean, I spent 15 years in these spaces, and I don't think, every once in a while I'm like, do I need a job? Do I have to go back? And I'm like, I really don't want to do it.
Yeah.
For all the reasons that you lay out in the book. And so let's go to the uses. You talk about first strike, and in the introduction, you kind of lay out 3 uses of first strike that you're kind of working with. And I think this is helpful in just kind of discussing some of the overall interventions that you decide to make based off of those, kind of lines of inquiry that you mentioned in the previous question.
Yeah. So the sort of first and probably most readily identifiable use of first strike is in terms of the 1994 legislation, which is Prop 184 here in the state of California, which is the 3 strikes law that gets passed. And, essentially for each strike, which is a felony charge that gets defined more or less based upon the whims of the DA or a range of offenses, you get more and more time assigned to prison, right? So like the first strike is between 5 to 10 years. The second strike is between 15 to 20 years. And then the third strike is 25 to life. And of course, I think we all know the anecdotes of some of the most absurd cases, where someone stole a box of pizza and that was their third strike and they were in prison for the rest of their life. And, for me, what I saw was that because the heavy arm of the state in the form of the police had been so ensconced within public schools that many Black schools had some form of a substation. It could be LA County Sheriff substation, LAPD substation that was directly on campus, that you can very likely catch your first strike while you were at school. And so that became sort of like a moment that I think for many people, like, it makes sense. But once again, I'm going back to the absurd nature of that. Like, that just shouldn't be the norm. And yet it is quite the norm for a lot of places around the country. The second meaning of the term first strike comes from the influence of W.B. Du Bois and in his book, Black Reconstruction in America, in which he makes the intervention of saying that the end of the Civil War is caused by a general strike of Black workers in the South to remove the advantage that the plantation bloc had both prior to and during the war. And in that book, Du Bois talks about that education was framed as a strategy to achieve liberation. And in this sense, education, as Du Bois lays out, was always at the sort of centerpiece of liberation struggles. Now, for Du Bois, it was a 2-pronged strategy where the Southern Bloc was going to be taxed essentially to the extent that it was going to remove their financial leverage to then form these schools throughout the whole sort of U.S. South, but also in the North as well. And then also you were going to have the mass education of everybody for the first time in the history of the country. And of course, we can talk about this later, but this becomes completely co-opted in various ways, which sort of then leads into the last meaning of first strike, which is that Black education has always been sort of the first strike of attack by entities, mostly finance and land and capital, to try to dampen, suppress Black freedom struggles. And so those 3 ways, I try to interweave that in the book as a way to understand the complexities of Black education, but then also one of the sort of prime drivers is to locate the ways in which the state and the informal aspects of the state are reacting to Black movement building, Black community building, in order to uphold sort of the logics of racial capitalism.
Yeah, we're recording this on November 29th, and yesterday morning, well, I don't know what time it was there, I guess it was whatever, but yesterday on my Twitter feed, I'm watching Elon Musk tour Palestine. He's touring with Netanyahu and Israel, obviously, and he gives this comment at the end. Somebody interviews him to ask him what his sort of takeaways are. And, his first one is I think he says we have to kill everybody who thinks it's okay to kill civilians or something along those lines, or we have to get rid of everybody who thinks it's okay to kill civilians, which is obviously this doesn't apply to Israel, right?
Right.
But then his second thing is we have to fix their education program.
Right.
That was his second thing, because he was we haven't educated this insurgency out of this population. And I thought, as I heard him say that, I immediately thought of this book, and we will get into kind of the co-optation and some of that history as well. But, what was it? His third one was you have to give them an avenue to prosperity, basically. But
straight out the colonial playbook, the whole thing.
But yeah, it is interesting that would be the thing that he would and I know that Israel has been, that's one of the things you'll always hear is that they want more control, greater control over the education. And they already, there's already a tremendous amount, but probably not as much in Gaza because they're not really in that space as much. But there's a tremendous amount of oversight over everything that Palestinian children are taught and read to try to ensure that there's nothing in it that, that's a whole separate conversation, but yeah, absolutely. So politics of enclosure is really central to this text. This is a framework that you're working with throughout this. One of the areas you look at this earlier on in the book is the assault on the arts that we've seen in public education. And, this is a really interesting phenomenon. My kids currently go to suburban schools. They're public schools, but they're outside of Philadelphia. And, Philly schools, the arts have been just totally assaulted and decimated in many ways. Even to the level where, I think there was a report last year that there are 4 schools within the district that have a library or something like that. Libraries have been taken away. The books have been taken out of them. Obviously there are always some magnet schools, right? There's always some schools within urban districts that do have the arts. But it's certainly, one of the first things to get targeted by kind of neoliberal education reform. One of the things that you point at is the connection between the arts and the Black arts movement, obviously the Black freedom struggle, and that it comes, there's obviously this could go one of the things I was thinking is in the suburban schools, you don't necessarily see that because the arts are very I guess you could say they're colonized, right? It's kind of, I guess, liberal multiculturalism, if anything, is kind of the order of the day around the arts, but it is not, there's not as much of a kind of radical edge to that. But that's kind of a whole other topic. because you're examining, you're at specific schools, and I guess we should say something about this because you do, I guess, field work. You were teaching in this book and you write about those experiences too. And there's also a conversation about the arts within education because people do love the arts, but then there is this primacy that gets placed, especially on math, English language arts, and science in schools. And so they do end up being, kind of the first thing attacked through austerity. You were talking in the book about the relationship to Black freedom struggle and Black arts movement. We just recently interviewed, it's not out yet, but Henry Threadgill on his book that he just recently published this year. And in it, he's talking about his upbringing in Chicago and stuff like that. And this would have been, I guess, 1950s. And, he had access to some pretty amazing arts resources, really, mentors, programs in schools, ends up going to, I think, an arts high school, and then getting into a college where he can do that. I think he dropped out and stuff like that, but like, still was exposed to a lot of things through the arts. So anyway, that's a long way around the bend, but basically just talk a little bit about how you are looking at this politics of enclosure and the role of the arts and the relationship of the Black freedom struggle or Black liberation struggle to those things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think you bring up a bevy of points here to be discussed. And in particular, the connection between the sort of like daily lived experience of Black youth in a school environment. So yeah, I was a roving long-term substitute teacher at a school for a year, which I call County High School in the book. And this particular sort of spark to explore this further happened. There was a young Black man who played the saxophone, and he really wanted to play in the jazz band. And the teacher, as it comes to find out, gave him the wrong date intentionally for the tryouts. And so he missed the tryouts and was told, he couldn't be in the jazz band. That's really what he wanted to do. So as I found out more and more, the young man's father actually was a pretty well-known musician. He had played with a lot of Motown groups. And so this notion of being sort of like an artist in a family was passed down from one generation to the next. This is combined with the fact that the way that jazz was taught at the school, you would have no idea that it was even made by Black people. Like the removal of Blackness was so profound that it was shocking. What I mean by that is, aside from the fact that every single poster that was in the room was of a non-Black person playing an instrument, there was no mention at all to any of the sort of like the known jazz greats that if you just listen to jazz, you would know that was being erased as well. So John Coltrane or Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, like the kids, unless they took it upon themselves to learn about jazz outside of the classroom, really didn't know who these people were. So then the question becomes, what does it mean to, quote unquote, celebrate Blackness in a way that's actually absent of the cultural production that was central to Blackness in the first place? And this becomes the case of jazz. So as I was processing all of this and doing the write-up for it, I had the opportunity and great fortune to meet and talk with Jane Cortez, who is the famed poet. And she's from LA and moves to New York, but talked at the time a great deal about the importance of, she went to Maynard's High School in LA, the importance of what her high school experience sort of had upon her development as an artist. In particular, because she also spoke to sort of like, once she graduates from high school, there's a huge void within LA of any type of nurturing of the arts in general. And so that high school experience was very important to her because, during that time period, as I mentioned in the book, there was a great emphasis within Black schools on the arts and on Black culture as well. Cortez's sort of upbringing also coalesces with Horace Tapscott's movement to LA as well. And George Lipschitz writes about this in terms of Horace Tapscott founding this band, and then this band is sort of moving around on the back of a pickup truck and becomes like the neighborhood band. And simultaneously, Horace Tapscott is being surveilled and tapped by both the FBI and the LAPD during this time period to see what exactly he's doing, what effect he's having upon neighborhoods and communities as well. And then once you begin to sort of dig in and you start asking questions of people who grew up around that time period, what you get is that the expression of Black culture in many ways ran counterculture to the dominant norms, right? That is sort of like a duh, of course. That's the long-standing sort of academic detailing of how that took place. But importantly, we oftentimes don't think of jazz in that way, but jazz has to be understood as central to the development of alternative epistemology, sort of that are seeped within music, right? And so that goes from when Black music is taught outside of the formal structures of school and not dictated by non-Black actors, what you see is a completely different manifestation of the art form. And most readily, that probably comes about if you think about the jazz artists who have come out of Los Angeles in the past 15 years. I'm thinking about Terrace Martin, Mossy Washington. Their music, their performance is seeped within a set of radical Black logics that itself is immersed within the Leimert Park soundscape from which they develop their music. So then you have to, aside from looking at schools, then you begin to have to look at institutions such as the World Stage, Fernando Pullum Community Arts Center, the work of Reggie Andrews at Locke High School, Chuck Edwards at Washington High School, Donald Simpson at Dorsey High School, who worked both within the school system, but importantly, outside of that school system, within these communities, to then inform a certain set of politics that are both, in many instances, anti-colonial, but then also have a particular sense of freedom to exist outside of the sort of here and now. And that type of thinking, of course, becomes very dangerous within a context where not only is the formal education apparatus trying to get you to think only within the here and now, but then also limit what your possibilities are within that here and now itself. So then this sort of cultural attachment of Blackness to art has to be severed in order to remove that possibility of thought from ever taking place. And it's only because of the fact that for many Black youth who are in schools, that there exists these spaces outside of the school, do we get the brilliance that's actually shown, right? If we just left to the hands of the school, you would never hear any of this, right? And then, of course, this is the story pretty much of every art form that's ever come out of the United States, right? It's not because of the training from arts programs within the schools. It's because of what's happening outside of the schools that's being nurtured by the community itself. And very often you will have people who are true indeed working within the schools, but they're working within a set of logics that's very difficult, and you have to figure out ways to sort of bend around that. And they also are very much linked to these other communities where really the real work kicks in.
That makes total sense. And I should say it also resonates with like Henry Threadgill's story too, because he's like, he has this whole thing. I mean, he actually is very critical of musical education, just in general, but like he has these little things he says of, oh yeah, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent, and things like this. And, and just sort of saying like, yeah, like that's how you learn to copy something, like basically, but it's not how you actually learn to create and innovate and develop, and so, yeah, I would say, I mean, I think it's tricky because obviously there's certain technical skills that you can pick up, within more formal musical education that can be helpful, but to really flourish as an artist, right? Like schools still probably, that framework is not necessarily fostered within the school itself.
It's not, I would say as an aside, when you look at the development there was a period between 1950s through maybe early 1990s where you could literally track where accomplished Black artists were coming from because of the high school of which you're coming from around the whole country. And so whether it's jazz, R&B, or hip hop, there's literally like these pockets. And it's not because there's something unique about the school per se or the school district. It's when you begin to dig a little deeper, there's these teachers who are at the schools who are intimately linked to these other cultural organizations, and they are tying that in together. So then it's not by chance that it's like certain schools that keep on producing like these top tier musicians and artists to develop. So it's not, and I'll say that again, schools actually work to do the exact opposite, which is to make sure that that type of art isn't developed. And it's only because of the sort of yeoman task that these teachers have taken upon themselves to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a great point. So chronologically, I guess, or historically speaking, chronologically, the first enclosure that you examine in the text is Christianity, and kind of why and how it was imposed upon Black enslaved folks. And I mean, this is interesting. I'm thinking about the Black radical, expressions, basically, that it was then, kind of the intervention to enclose upon, I guess.
Right. And this actually ties right into the previous question, which is part of what drew me to understand Christianity as a dominant model of enclosure, was to try to get at the root cause of culture enclosures within education. So how is it that this became a normative way of understanding that the removal of Black culture was logical for the development of an education sort of system? And one of the primary drivers, of course, once you began looking at the history of education in this country, is the intersection between the Christian missionary sort of ethos and that of the formation of Black schools. And these are missionary schools or just regular schools that get adopted by the state. So then once you peel back that layer, it then became very important to understand what was it about Black culture that was such a threat to the formation of the imperial project of the United States, that the sort of development of a particular type of Christian ethos became the norm. And I say that because what became readily apparent to me is that Christianity becomes used as a disciplining force to suppress Black cultural expression, Black culture radicalism, Black culture manifestation from generation to generation. And in large part, this as a way to sort of not have to run down 150 to 200 year history, I'll try to sum it up really quickly, which is that what became evident between the plantation bloc and Christian missionaries was that left into their own hands, the sort of the driving ethos of the Bible, as we say, or the Western Christian Bible, was going to lead to revolt and uprisings across the whole country, right? And so it's well documented, and I talk about in the book with Denmark VC and Nat Turner, how that unfolds. But aside from that, there was hundreds of revolts that took place throughout the 1800s that are informed by a spiritual practice. And this pretty much scares the slander class to death. And so there's this alliance that gets forged with the missionary class, who essentially agreed to do the behest of the plantation bloc, with the agreement that the sort of the gospel that's going to be taught is going to be a gospel about being subservient, a gospel about being docile, and a gospel that it's about the suppression of Blackness at every single turn, right? So there is no cultural marker that Black people have once you have this turn that takes place at all. And there's no mention of Africa. So what you see is an attempt to completely cut off any type of past that Black people had prior to arriving into the colonies, as a way to try to prevent all of these revolts and uprisings that were taking place. So, and I should mention that this is being done, when I say Christianity, in this regard, between the Protestant faith and the planter bloc. And I mentioned it in the book that there's a distinction because the Catholic Church had this a little bit more refined than a Protestant church did, in large part because the Catholic Church is already based upon a strict hierarchical model. And so it's very easy to control the word, as it said, right? And what gets sort of passed down has to be approved by the Pope and then archbishops and, so on and so forth, right? But importantly, the Catholic Church very much was involved in this process as well, in particular with respect to land ownership in the colonies. It was very important that someone had to work the land. So their model pretty much was, well, we'll just baptize every single enslaved African that we have and they'll be Catholic. by the time that they get here to the New World, and we will instill with them what it means to be a member of this church. And a member of this church meaning you will have a very defined role in which your life outcomes will be. And I should mention, because your question was about the radical tendencies with the Protestant church, what you see, and Cedric Robinson talks about this extensively in his book, An Anthropology of Marxism, which is that there were several different types of orientations, even regarding Western Christian practices, that pretty much get cut and trimmed and cut and trimmed so you get like only one understanding. And the reason why I bring that up is that you have these figures and movements in the colonial sort of expansion of the United States, such as Theodore Parker and the Secret Six, who have a completely different orientation to what Christianity is. And so they, of course, are probably not as well known for the act that they funded, but the act that they funded is well known, which is the raid on Harper's Ferry with John Brown, which was just one of several attempts that were made to undermine the plantation bloc. And so not only did you have Black radical sort of formations of spiritual practices that were taking place, you also had I'll use this term, non-dominant Western formations that were also taking a hold as well. And this became very much a problem for both the industrial North, because there was severe critiques of what was going on in the North, and then also the plantation bloc as well. And this, in many respects, is why I said that the Catholic Church was in some ways more advanced in their suppressive tactics, because the Catholic Church didn't allow any Black priest into the congregation until the early 20th century. And even those Black priests who they allowed in were readily known not to have any ties to Black communities at all. And then very often when they did bring in Black priests, they intentionally brought in Black priests who they knew were not at all politicized in that way. And so I'll end that sort of story, because we can go on and on about spiritual practice. But I think importantly, what the main driver to understand is this idea of culture being a very important process to revolt and uprising is directly linked to the development of Western Christian practice within the U.S.
Yeah, right on. And it was a very interesting section. And as we've talked about a little bit, like one of the things that you're looking at, and I really do appreciate this intervention, because like even after our last conversation, I reached out to some of my, prison abolitionists organizing comrades, and, the general mood was, yeah, that school to prison pipeline thing never really quite sat right with me. And, and so obviously, as you already said, you kind of want to look at the school to prison pipeline and kind of trouble that, this kind of easy discussion of, one, there's the kind of slogan of schools, not prisons and stuff like that. But then there's also this connection between exclusionary discipline in particular as somehow like a driver of mass incarceration. So one of the things you address that is missing in the analysis of the school to prison pipeline is that, quote, an analysis of just how and why prison and education policy have become two sides of the same coin of Black education, end quote. And so you talk about your experience at County High School. As we've already said, that's a pseudonym is not the right word, but if it was a person, it would be a pseudonym, I guess.
Right.
And how you had students who both like intimately knew, kind of the violence and hyper-surveillance of policing in their communities in Black and brown neighborhoods, as well as how you could, this is interesting, like in the book you talk about how kind of ready they are to hear or to kind of be interested, or they make a kind of organic sense, I guess, these concepts of like anti-imperialism or Pan-Africanism that, once introduced and explained, they're quite interested, or they can see the value of these ideas, despite the fact that they've, not encountered them, of course, in educational spaces before. But at the same time, these same students, many of them are looking at jobs and they're thinking, and they will eventually, some of them will join military or policing institutions. And this is something, Yeah, I've had offline conversations with some folks about this. Cesar Che Rodriguez, who I know you know, and Alejandro Villalpando, like folks who work at these, like basically kind of working class institutions within, public universities and stuff like that within California. And they're often at places that have these huge criminal justice departments, huge departments that are focused on basically helping Black and brown people get jobs within the carceral system, whether it's policing or something within the criminal justice arena. And it's a fascinating thing like that. I mean it makes total sense, but there's a kind of whole like academic industry, I guess, built up around this. And so just talk a little bit about that from your reflections at County High School and kind of how you saw that nexus at a high school level.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to what both Alejandro and Che both discussed, which is this, right? Which you have students who are intimately aware of the multiple forms of violence that exist because of more or less like the creation and the maintenance of a police state and what that does to their families, to their lives, and to their communities as well. That is happening in large part because it's been enabled due to the evisceration of any type of like sustainable labor market for them to work in, right? And so when you have the evisceration of jobs where you can actually get paid a living wage, the gig economy is not going to replace those thousands of jobs that were removed. And these students know that, right? Like I can't get a job working as an independent contractor and expect for my bills to get paid for a long-term solution. That's A, right? And in particular, I think it's of note that the idea of like a pension, for example, which was something in the 1980s that was like a no-brainer, has been completely removed. The idea of having like good health benefits has been completely removed. That now has been outsourced to the worker. All right. Okay. So that, of course, is known to everybody. You don't need to know anything about education to know that. The issue becomes, how do I, as a teacher, then try to explain to a young Black person, a young Latinx person, that even though it looks like that's your best option to go work for some aspect of the police state, whether that be a parole officer, a probation officer, to work as a CO, whatever, you actually should do X, Y, or Z. And I don't necessarily have a ready-made template plan to do X, Y, and Z, because oftentimes the jobs that are, will allow you to have a little bit of freedom and movement are not necessarily pathway type of jobs, right? Like you got to have a connection to know somebody to then go here, to go there, right? And it just doesn't compare because the state has a ready-made platform job. So where these jobs are good jobs. I'm not saying that they're good jobs in the sense of that they're jobs that are good for society. I'm saying that they're good jobs in that typical way when we think about like a good job. You actually still have a pension. You actually have damn good health benefits as well. So one of the things that you then come up upon is, how do I counter this logic that is made by the state to then say you shouldn't do these things which are going to help your family? Because I can't tell them, hey, you should go to college, because immediately I'm thinking of, well, why would I incur all of this debt? And then I know family members who have gone to college and they have the exact same job prospects as I would coming out of high school. Like it doesn't make any sense. And he told me to go to grad school to then get more debt. Like that seems like a setup, right? And so like, okay, well, that part I understand very well. Like that makes sense. In this current moment, there's very little that can be offered as a viable alternative because of the ways that the sort of state has set that up, right? And I only mention this because when have been in conversations with activists and organizers, we have talked about the ways in which this part of the sort of fight against the carceral state somehow has gotten sort of left out of the equation, which is that in many ways, when you are talking about dismantling the carceral state, what you have to keep in mind is that you're also, in this moment, you're talking about dismantling jobs for many Black people who have been sort of given the only pathway out, which is that these are the jobs that are available. Now, of course, the sort of logic behind that is perverse, right? Because you have Black people, lock a number of Black people, whatever, right? But the understanding of how that gets made oftentimes happens within schools, because you see pretty much by the time you become a junior or senior what the options are made to you. Now, I will say that as sort of a moment of like hope, perhaps, is that following the 1992 rebellion in LA, the city put in place several different LAPD training academies within Black high schools and later on within Latinx high schools, with an explicit goal of creating a pipeline between high schools to the police. And the most recent data that I saw is that while they were effective in being able to recruit Latinx youth, they have not been effective at all in recruiting Black youth in the same ways. So there is something about the Black experience of growing up, right, which is like working for the police is crazy, right? It doesn't make any sense at all. But there's also a way, and what I found, and it'd be interesting to talk with Che and Alejandro about this, is that the probation department has done a much better way of sort of softening its approach to youth so that they make it look like as if it's like a social work type of aspect to it. And so many are drawn to that because it looks like that you're helping your community out in the process of working for the state agency. And the last thing that I mentioned about this is you just have to think about how much work, effort, and energy that goes into making or attempt to make this look like a viable option. And we were talking about briefly about charter schools. They don't have them as much in LA, but I know they're real popular in Chicago, which are these military charter schools, which literally become like the viable way for Black boys to become men and become responsible citizens. But then because of how they're being trained to become diligent workers within this state process, which is going to have tremendous adverse violence upon the Black communities from which they're coming out of as well. So those type of structural impositions have to be looked at in terms of the amount of investment that the state has in, once again, trying to suppress any type of what we think about alternatives, right? Which, going back to our previous conversation, if you were to have more viable aspects of Black arts then introduced into education, you can see immediately where this is going to become a problem, of how it's going to be very difficult to then advocate for having as a viable job option to work for the carceral wing of the state in tandem with talking about freedom of movement, freedom of being, and self-expression. These two things do not go hand in hand as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole interesting discussion in itself. So, this is like a short question, or it's more of a remark, honestly, than a question, but this is a small part of the book, but you mentioned how the 1984 Olympic Games was this moment of expanding LAPD policing power and militarization. And I thought this was a really interesting observation. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, left-wing progressive folks, counter-organize against Olympic Games. A lot of times that discussion centers around displacement and gentrification and, a lot of it is about displacement, and, usually it kind of crushes a community and moves them out of somewhere and they never can come back in and all that kind of stuff. But I hadn't really thought a lot about this from a policing perspective before. So I don't know if like I said, it's a brief part in the text. I don't know if there's something brief you want to say about it, but I found it really interesting.
Yeah. So the 84 Olympics in LA comes about as a critical time with respect to the LAPD, because at the LAPD is really ramping up their sort of militaristic ambitions, with the physical manifestations of that being weapons, right? And so you have like the Batarang becomes like a huge sort of a symbol for the LAPD, where they go around with this huge giant tank and busting in the homes of Black Angelenos. And so both on a formal organizing level, the collections, which we talked about before in the previous discussion, of COPPA, but the collections of several other organizations, people are adamantly opposed to the Olympics on the basis of these weapons that are about to be coming into the hands of the LAPD. The reasons why the LAPD is able to make this sort of demand is for the safety of Los Angeles, right? And so the specter of the Cold War is looming in the background. Because of 1980s, there was a boycott of the Olympics in which a whole bunch of Western nations, including the United States, didn't go. And so in order to protect from any potential threat, the LAPD argues that it needs a whole cadre of tanks, advanced military systems that run the gamut. And then ironic enough, they also invoke what happened in Munich as well. And I say ironic because of the current moment that we're in. And so they say, well, if any threat were to happen similar, they don't want to have another 1972 on their hands with the Munich Olympics, which, I mean, it's taken straight from, you can see the colonial gameplay that's festering out here as well. So this becomes very vital, a vital moment, because these weapons are being gotten from the federal government. It's not as if after these weapons are being handed to the LAPD, they're going to give them back, right, to the federal government. Once they're in their care, then it's open season. And that literally is what takes place. Like, all these weapons then begin used upon the Black community, both in the build up to the 84 Olympics, but then also after the 84 Olympics as well. And much of what took place in terms of the organizing efforts for 84 against the build up to the reasons of what you're saying for displacement, gentrification as well, but because people here are intimately aware of what happens when these weapon systems get used, it's also being used as a logic to try to fight against what's happening, because the Olympics are going to be here again soon, not in 24, but even 2028. They're going to be in Los Angeles as part of the next games. And many other organizations are using that same sort of tactic of letting people know, like, all right, there's going to be an introduction of a whole bunch of new weapon systems that are going to be put into your day-to-day life because of these games. And once the games leave, those weapons are going to remain.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So another of the things that you examine is this kind of moral panic around truancy, connections to juvenile delinquency and gang activity, which gangs is its own, I mean, it's a moral panic,
right?
all of its own. In particular, the thing you're looking at here that I found really interesting was the discussion of the gang truce in LA, the radical kind of possibilities of that moment, coming out of kind of the Rodney King, riots and moment. And again, you bring in here Michael Zinzin, who's a key figure within the LA Black Panther Party, and then COPPA, which you already mentioned, which for people who don't know is Coalition Against Police Abuse, right? That's
right.
So, longtime organizer in LA whose collection is at the Southern California Library. But you talk about him in relation also to this gang truce moment. And so Zinzin illustrated the threat gang truces in LA as well as Chicago as well, which had an interesting, similar moment, that these pose to the status quo. So say a little bit about what the LA truce in particular sought to kind of do, like the politics of the truce, I guess, in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. I should state up front that perhaps the best treatment of understanding the work of the truce and Zinzin's role in it is in João Pasta Vargas's book, Catching Hell in the City of Angels, which masterfully lays out the development of how the truce actually came about. Because João worked very closely with Zinzin and got to see sort of the insights of what took place. But, the truce itself develops out of housing projects, like these Black housing projects in Watts and in other parts of South Central LA, including Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, and Nickerson Gardens. And it's important to note here that the truce is a cross-generational endeavor with political education sort of flowing both ways amongst generational linkages. And it's also important to note that the truce itself, which is between the Bloods and the Crips, by the way, even though it sort of becomes made famous because of the 92 rebellion, it should be noted that the truce was already in plans prior to the rebellion itself. But what happens is sort of the unabashedly sort of naked violence of racial capitalism gets put on full display throughout the course of the trial itself. And the subsequent revolt both informed and was led by those networks that were already established with the buildup of the truce. And that, I just want to stop and drive that home, because the rebellion oftentimes gets categorized as either Black people attacking their own neighborhoods or as having no plan at all. But it's important to note that when you look at it from the vantage point of the gang truce, you see, in fact, that it was very well planned, that different sects within different neighborhoods very much had control over what was happening and how it was to take place and to happen, with the main goal of driving the police out of Black neighborhoods itself, right? So when put in that context, you can understand why the truce becomes, in fact, a threat to the stability of racial capitalism in LA. And I'll just take a moment here to actually use the words of Zinzin himself as he's describing why it was that the city officials and city planners did everything in their power to try to stop the truce from actually happening. And this is a quote here: "It is a threat to them to have young people working together, demanding jobs, demanding justice. They've never come out and supported the truce. In fact, the city has recently expanded the anti-terrorist division to eliminate probable cause necessary to investigate a crime. This means I can call and say, I think you're doing something wrong, and they can spy on you for 6 months and tap your phones without any other evidence. By assuming that gang members are storing guns and drugs, they can actually tap phones and spy on people without a warrant extension for another 90 days just on a tip." Now, this becomes important because you can see the ways in which the truce then becomes used as a way to justify the extension of the carceral state into the lives of Black communities, so that not only is the city working behind the scenes to destabilize the truce, and there was many anecdotes of that taking place, but also in broad daylight, because of how this policy was made to make it look like the work between the Crips and the Bloods was this an extension of criminal activity, that there actually wasn't a plan that was coming up, right? And so that becomes important to note just on the face of understanding the propaganda efforts that were being put forward by sort of city planners and city officials. But the other side of it is the work that was being done by private capital, so that the truce itself put forth a document, and in that document, they laid out a list of demands and objectives that needed to be met as a result of the 92 rebellions. Well, private capital then organizes, and one of the key organizers of the 92 plan, which was called Rebuild LA, Peter Uberhall, was also a major figure in the 1984 Olympics as well. And what happens is that those same resources, those same demands that are to put both material capital, but then also aspects of being able to have autonomy to make decisions around issues of education, are then thrust back into the hands of private capital and the formation of businesses and land developers as well. So that the shift with the Rebuild LA plan, which becomes the plan that the city then uses, is that what gets determined to be in the best interest is put into the hands of businesses who then get millions of dollars to supposedly invest in these same communities that had just made these demands of how they should act out their own visions of freedom. And so part of what we have to, think about is that the reason why I say it's that the truce is working prior to 92 is that one of the aims of the truce is to undo the over previous 2-decade buildup of a truly fascist police state that had been governing Black LA. And similar to what had taken place after Reconstruction, you have a severe co-optation of that vision by private capital as a way to maintain the status quo, through reformist efforts. And I don't even think it's reformist because it's straight retrograde, because it's not as if you're changing the system. You're just sort of putting a Band-Aid on a gushing wound, right? So that's a bad analogy too, because it's not even that at all, right? You're actually insulting people at this point and just letting them know that you don't care. But importantly, I think what it does is that it attempts to drive that the only way to have a solution is to work within the confines of this capitalist market-driven system in order to make change. And the truth is saying like, no. We want to undo that and create a new model.
Yeah, appreciate that. So one of the things you talk about is this idea of the lockdown model. And so there's a quote here: lockdown model was established during the 1960s at Jefferson High School in LA. It had been refined to the point that it operated as the status quo in the enclosure of student action, end quote. You go on to write that, quote, students are not being trained for prison, and Black students have a firm understanding of the technologies of control that we would normally associate with prisons, end quote. So throughout this chapter, you examine your experiences as a substitute. One of the things that you talk about is your time in the in-school suspension, room, which, yeah, I'll let you talk about that. But also within classrooms, and the kind of, the various sort of racist and carceral logics that operate as quite normative within all of these spaces. And, I should say, I don't know how much of this is what you're referring to as the lockdown model. So maybe say what the lockdown model is, but also, and say a little bit about where that came from historically, as well as some of those long-term effects. But also, and yeah, we can do this as a follow-up or whatever. I mean, I'm interested in the degree to which you think it's not all encapsulated within the kind of idea of the lockdown model, to speak beyond the limits of that model, to talk about kind of what you're observing in this chapter in particular. I can't remember what it's called. I apologize, but it's one where you're really looking at in depth at kind of these carceral logics at County High School.
Sure, yeah. The question refers back to, of course, any other questions, right? But also to the first question in terms of understanding the sensitivity of schools to issues of discipline being lobbied at them. And so then you have increasingly more and more these in-house suspension rooms, which are placed on campus, which I can get to. But to answer your question about the lockdown model and the history of it with regards to Southern California, is there's a football game that takes place between Jefferson and Crenshaw high schools, which at the time were all Black high schools. There's a fight that breaks out at the game. And I should mention, this is after the 1965 Watts revolt, and that's going to become important in a moment. As a response to that fight, over 100 police officers make their way onto the campus of Jefferson High School. The students then go on strike, and they say that we're not coming back to school unless the cops leave. There's an agreement that's made. The agreement is that the police will leave the school, but they're going to leave as sort of like the formal security apparatus of the school, but they're going to start teaching classes in the school. And so there's a whole curriculum that's built called Police and Government, in which LAPD officers then begin teaching. And when you look through the curriculum, what you can see is that they're in fact gathering huge amounts of data and trying to figure out who's actually in the schools and who's potentially sort of like the leader of the next Watts rebellion. Because they're asking questions like, what do you do if the police pull you over? What are your rights? How do you respond? This is what the Bill of Rights says, but this actually is what it means to you. They say, were you involved in 1965? Do you have family members who were involved? Who were they? There's all these, like, they're just gathering a whole set of important information for them, right? That's important to know because this comes prior to what we think of like the expansion of the carceral state, right? So this is the 60s, right? And so you already have cops on campuses of Black high schools that just from that point forward begins to expand their role from being actual formal teachers to then just being a whole presence in of itself by the time we get to 1990s and the DARE program and so on and so forth, right? But for me, a key aspect of the lockdown model itself is the connection that's made between Black behavior and the need to lock down. And what I mean by that is the LA school system sets up these, what they call behavior modification sites, where students who are identified via these classes that are being taught by the police are sent to these sites to then change their behavior from being one of like leading the next 1965 moment to then being a proper citizen. And that then ties directly into the work of Orasami Burton, who's talking about psychological warfare that's going on within prisons, and literally the same language is used, like these behavior modification units. They're both following the same type of paths, right? Which is that you have to greatly affect and change the behavior aspect of people, right? So aside from the fact of having a permanent presence within the sort of site of Black schools, which you also have to keep in mind is that via the lockdown model, that education becomes a critical site to this aspect of psychological sort of matters of warfare, psychological damage that's incurred upon Black youth. So, and it makes that Elon Musk statement that much more bold and problematic as well, because you know exactly what these sort of purveyors of a particular type of education are thinking. With regard to then in-house suspension, as I mentioned before, these are sort of sites within schools that are already layered within a warehousing aspect. And so just as an aside, for those who've worked in schools, this will already be familiar. But just teaching inside of schools that have a predominantly Black or Latinx population, the vast majority of the day, the youth are working on these standards and this sort of testing curriculum in which they're doing essentially nothing for the whole day. And what I mean by nothing is like literally the whole day in a math class, let's say we're teaching 10th grade math, will be spent just doing times tables, because according to the test results, the students are not faring well on this particular aspect of learning. And so you're instructed then as a teacher to just teach times tables all day. Well, for those who've been around 14, 15-year-old kids, you can imagine by the time you get to like the twos place, you've lost them already. Like it's a wrap, because they understand like there's nothing going on here, right? And with regards to that when you multiply that times however many classes are happening within schools each day times that many students, you can see that students are just being physically like warehoused to literally do nothing. Okay, so that's sort of like the base level. But then you have a much more intense level of warehousing that's going on for those students who dare to speak back to authority in any way, right? And so this is pretty much left up to the discretion of teachers or administrators and staff as to what that is, right? So when I was teaching there, and I mentioned this in the book, is that you had youth in there who were just in there because they told the teacher to shut up or do something else, right? And you ask, why did you tell that teacher to shut up, right? Well, because they told me to do X, Y, Z, and I thought that was rude, whatever, right? And so they automatically get sent to this room in which they do nothing the whole day. If they didn't bring any work with them, or if they didn't have anything with them, they literally just have to sit there for the entire day. And they have prescribed times when they can go to the restroom. The room itself is monitored in terms of like climate control. You can't control the temperature at all. It's usually pretty cold in there with the purpose of keeping them up the whole day so that they don't sleep. Nothing happens in this room at all. And so you're left with like, what is the point of this, right? Like if the goal of education actually is to teach about like learning, and you have these rooms on these campuses where nothing is happening in the school, what is the end goal? So then you get back to this notion that the idea of education in this regard is a formation of psychological warfare. It's literally to try to break students down, right? And then once again, you have the parallels between schools and prisons in this way, which is, it's not the pipeline aspect of it, which is something that I try to come back to again and again. I think it's important to have a discussion about the dynamics between schools and prisons. But we have to reframe what that discussion is, because in many ways, schools are just as insidious as prisons. And once you begin to understand how these sort of models, like the lockdown model, work, it begins to really change the inner workings, inner dynamics, interstitial sort of compatibilities between schools and prisons, of being less a pipeline and more of they are speaking to each other. Like these structures, these ways of control are speaking to each other. And oftentimes, as I mentioned before with the Rebuild LA plan, are facilitated by private capital, which is the need to have these programs. I'm going back to Elon Musk again. It's no surprise then that one of the biggest private capitalists is saying we need to have these programs, because this is a disruption to the sort of working logics of racial capitalism itself.
Yeah, right on. I'm thinking about the time when I listened to administrators over the year talk about how they needed like a dominant male presence and would be excited if somebody had like military experience or like police background or something like that. And like the overlap there of just like what you want this like really commanding kind of disciplinary regime, and these things take a lot of different forms, but like they're just in the psychology of administrators, the fact that would be something that you would think, right? Like this will be good for these boys that we can't control, right? Or whatever.
Exactly. And you know what I should mention too, just to make it very explicit, which is that at the same time that these types of programs, such as there's this Abolish Chronic Truancy program that comes about in the 1990s, which puts matters of truancy for Black youth, explicitly for Black youth, under the control of the LA District Attorney's Office, right? This is becoming a big program. The LA Times runs a whole story about truancy. For Black youth, they're categorized under this ACT program, right? But then the Times runs a whole nother story about how for white youth in the Valley region of Southern California, there's a whole different type of program, which is absent of the carceral state. So literally there's two different programs that are going on, one for white youth and one for Black youth, just to make it explicitly known, right? Like this is a lot of work. So you need a specific type of educational agenda to be enacted for this to actually work out.
Yeah. So you have this chapter, Troubled Man, which, I thought was a very interesting chapter. I mean, there's this story that you relay in it about, nonprofits, which I also had, that's, my own history is in between the worlds of education and nonprofits, which is a pretty terrible place to be. But you had this discussion about funding, right, at a certain point in this chapter too, of like mentorship programs and stuff like that. And, for Black boys, and I thought that this was a really interesting intervention that you're making here. You talk about it, about, quote, the formulation of a state-based Black masculine subject, end quote. And, note that this is a particular type of heteronormative masculine subject. You also talk about this as explicitly really as an attempt to undermine certain formations of Black organizing, of, we could say like Black radical relationships of care, whatever, right? And so you highlight types of programs and mentorship and sports that often focus on, kind of cultivating certain expressions of Black manhood as a solution to the problems of the Black community. And again, this gets back to what you talked about earlier on in terms of this kind of self-help idea as well. Like I said, working in these spaces, I've seen these types of approaches, these types of regimes. I mean, the whole thing about the way that funding works within the foundation, state, and nonprofit world. And like, I worked in Philly a couple of years ago, and there's been an uptick of shootings, right? And then everybody decides that there's going to be like the violence prevention programming is going to be the funding thing. And this all takes a specific, the funders outline the kind of objectives that they're looking for. I mean, it's very interesting, not in a good way, but as an object of kind of study, I think, of what they're doing with this. What I thought was interesting in this too is like you're not directly responding, I don't think, to the field of Black male studies here. I don't know the timing of when some of those interventions started to happen, and when this came out. Maybe it was a little bit before, kind of at the beginning of some of that stuff starting to come out. But, this chapter I thought is interesting because in some ways you're really sort of looking at, a focus around Black men, Black masculinity, the kind of state-based heteronormative, like a specific state intervention that's happening around Black masculinity. And at the same time, you're very much in dialogue with Black feminists in this chapter, Beth Ritchie, Arrested Justice, stuff like that within this chapter. And you note that. So I guess to get back to the question that I'm asking here, like, what do you think this state-based program is promoting? Is it promoting a particular type of Black masculinity? What is it actually doing? And what types of, as you're going back to looking at this, I guess, as an enclosure again, like, what is it enclosing upon? What is the Black radical possibility organizing that you see it as potentially undermining?
So I think as an overall model, and this goes back to the endangered species sort of model as well, is that it places matter of behavior and cultural responsibility politics as the cure for the inherent exploitative nature of racial capitalism. And as an anecdote, in terms of how it goes against the ethos of Black organizing, it's because the emphasis is so keen on training young Black boys to be proper men to then sort of head the families and be responsible. And as Obama famously said, like, pull up your pants type of model, it goes against the ethos of actually the dynamics of what were taking place in radical organizing spaces. And back to this anecdote, I remember Michael Zinzin was telling me that oftentimes the Black Panther Party, it gets sort of reduced to Black men with guns walking around neighborhoods or the state capitol, for example, in California. But he was saying that women were actually the ones oftentimes who were leading the training exercises for gun classes, because they were actually the ones that were taking the time to figure out how to actually properly use a gun. And as Zinzin said that, he said Black dudes are more into like the going out and like the Wild Wild West type of aspect of using a gun. And so the training programs and learning how to use weapons being led by women is something that gets completely removed from this equation. In addition to the fact that the less glamorous programs, or perhaps more important programs, such as the free breakfast programs, were staffed by both men and women working in kitchens to feed Black families during this time period. So this emphasis on like returning Black men to some sort of like hierarchical place goes against the actual workings of what's happening in Black orgs, right? Okay, so that anecdote aside, what I found very interesting is that in many regards, when we think about the advent of this sort of model, we immediately go to the Moynihan report and the culture of poverty sort of myth, which, I don't need to rehash, here again. But I think what struck me was looking through an archive of Black people in the Catholic Church, was that in the early 1900s, there's this conference that's being held, and it's being held by the Catholic Church in the United States. And one of the main things that they bring up is the need to have Black men to be restored back to the head of the household. This struck me, it was like this thing in 1901 or 1903. Because I was like, oh, this is an old pernicious myth that's been around for quite some time. So I was in conversation recently with Sarah Haley, who's wrote a wonderful book called No Mercy Here, in which she discusses how Black women were used as a way to remake gender at the turn of the 20th century, when the role of gender was greatly in flux. And what she pointed out is that during this time period, right, that there's an understanding, or the need to make an understanding of the fact that a few things are going on, right? That the Black family is there for servitude and the white family is here for leisure. So you have to make this sort of like a role, right? And so this is where you get, you can see that the training, for example, of Black education is to train Black women to become domestic workers within the household, and to train Black men to become menial service labor as well. So that's one aspect of it, right? But then importantly, there's these court cases that she mentions where judges come out and they sentence Black youth to the chain gang, and they explicitly blame the mothers in their sentencing. They said that because these children were raised poorly by Black women, they then need to have some sort of disciplining aspect in place to then make this Black child a proper acting citizen. This is very important because this points out the need to have an ignoring amount of structural work on the part of the structure of education, as well as the law field, with a sort of burgeoning system of courts that are developing to in order to implement a form of justice that then is going to attempt to normalize the subservience of Black women as being unfit mothers, as well as to understand that Black men need to be a particular type of laborers as well. And you can see the early antecedents of then how you get to the sort of model of the end of Moynihan, when saying, which this leans in on that to the nth degree in order to make this claim look real and real and real. But, important for me in understanding how this played out was in addition to organizing efforts on the part of radical organizations, I was also interested in the daily politics of how this played out in day-to-day life. And so when you look at the work of like Saidiya Hartman, who talks about the importance and the role of underground economies such as fortune tellers and number runners, who oftentimes were Black women, they were causing a particular type of upheaval to the day-to-day politics of running a city. And like they drove city planners nuts because it was operating outside of the logics of how Black people need to be existing within this economy of actually both building up a particular set of economic values, right? But at the same time, it's a problem if Black communities have autonomous control over matters of the economy as well. And so I think, one of the important aspects of it is how is it that Black feminists are making their articulation that if you think about politics different than a viable participation in mainstream politics, then what you see is actually a way to then articulate a particular type of Black masculine subjectivity that exists way outside of those bounds of this properly acting sort of citizen, right? So part of it is to have an investment in those set of politics that goes against the grain of the civic. And then that just opens up a plethora of what it could be for like expression of masculinity. Okay, so taking those set of ideas and sort of logics together, you then think about how that gets played out within a model like My Brother's Keeper, which then works to, in many ways, discipline any aspect of a set of politics that works outside the boundaries of racial capitalism. So in the case of Los Angeles, the probably emblematic figure of this is Tom Bradley. So Tom Bradley was the first Black mayor of Los Angeles and second Black mayor of a large urban center in LA. He works his way up through the LAPD and then eventually gets elected mayor. And this is important to note because as he's elected mayor, one of the governing sort of things that he has to do is to keep in check this behavior because of what happened in 1965, right? They're like, all right, you need to make sure that this doesn't, happen again. And that becomes explicitly known because more or less Bradley's objective is a reformist objective. And what I mean by that is one of the first things that he does is to have a meeting with the Crips, right? Known as like a gang, he using that term, but the gangster of the Crips. And what he tells them they need to do is to change the R in Crips from revolutionary to reformist, right? So literally when I say like his agenda is set on reform, it's not being hyperbolic at all. Like he's trying to have a reformist foot take hold within the city because the politics that lead from the Watts Rebellion are very well known, right? So he then begins to usher in a wave of draconian police policies that sought to criminalize both formal organizing, but then also those sort of informal practices that we spoke about before that go against the grain and the demands of what racial capitalist logic wants and needs. And so as a matter of policy then, you can see when My Brother's Keeper comes in, they use that Bradley, in terms of from LA, they use that Bradley model as a template. And one of the first groups that they go to as a way, when I say they, I mean like funders go to, as a way to implement, in addition to the nonprofit sector, is to gang intervention workers. And going against a revolutionary ethos and to ensure that it is purely about reform, you have to understand that one of the main platforms that gang intervention workers want to do is to dismantle gangs, which then, talking about the truce, goes against the direct objective of the truce. Explicitly within the truce, it says we need to keep the structure of these organizations around because they're very vital in order to make and produce alternative ways of understanding how to live, right? And so there's all this money that's being poured into gang intervention workers during this time, using them as mentors and models, as opposed to those people who are already in existence who are doing the work within communities to actually, go against the ravages of city politics. So as that's happening and as that's sort of being furthered by this coalescence of gang intervention workers, nonprofit sectors, schools as well, it's important to know that all of these organizations are in constant articulation with the carceral state at the same time, right? Because in many instances, it may be that gang intervention workers are on probation and parole, and this looks like a good job. So then as they are going back to their POs, they're saying like, oh yeah, I'm doing this, X, Y, and Z. The schools aren't on direct articulation because they're already intimately tied. And then the nonprofit world, these foundations become tied together through funding schemes, right? So when everybody, as you mentioned, everybody's brought to the table, it's not just the nonprofits are brought to the table. You got city and county agencies who are also brought to the table, and then they lead sort of the edict on what's to happen. Now, this becomes a major problem with regards to the actual lived experience of Black women during this time period that we're talking about in LA in particular, because this is on the heels of a 20 plus year time period where Black women's bodies are being sort of found dead in different areas of South Central LA. Not different areas, actually it's like a 5-mile radius of South Central LA. And this gets known as the Grim Sleeper case. And the incredible work of Julie Grigsby, who details what happens when you have a politics of respectability that's put on to quote unquote like sexually wayward welfare queen Black women whose bodies become disposable. And what I mentioned by this is that for me, the important aspect of it was the figure of Lonnie Franklin Jr., who committed what's now known to be over 70 murders of Black women in LA, did so in a manner of which he was afforded because he very much bought into a particular type of masculine performance that was like heralded, right? And so part of that masculine performance was that like he was great with his hands, he worked hard, he always kept his family fed, and all those parts are, I think, worthy of like yeah, of course, like you should do that, like type of thing, right? Okay, that aside, there was also a much more virulent side that like he would readily articulate to neighbors that like sex workers need to be killed, like they need to be taken out and shot and things of this nature, right? Which is out in the open, but I'll only mention that with regard to the fact that the ways in which he talks about Black women as sex workers is an intimate tie. And this is proven by the fact that as the case unfolds, the LAPD has no idea like who these women are at all. And it becomes sad and absurd at the same time, because what they then do is because they find, I should say, just as this is going down a little bit of a rabbit hole of the case itself, but Lonnie Franklin Jr. is only found out ironic enough because of the expansion of the carceral state into Black life, which is that his son gets arrested. They do a DNA swab test, and it comes out as a positive for one of the women who was missing, right? In terms of they found that same DNA with this DNA, but they know that it can't be him because he's way too young, right? So then they're like, it has to be his father. So then they raid his father's house and they find all these pictures, like over 100 pictures, because he would always take Polaroid pictures, right? the LAPD has no idea who any of these Black women are. So then they make these giant billboards along freeways in particular of LA. So like, if you know who these women are, please call this number and X, Y, and Z, right? And as reporters began sort of digging into the backstories of these women, because initially they were called the strawberry killings, strawberry being a pejorative term to talk about sex workers. But then as reporters began doing backstories, they found out that in addition to sex workers, you had students, you had mothers, of course, and daughters, aunts, workers of all types, right? People who didn't have jobs. You just have Black women who are living in LA, right? But they get reduced to this sort of moralistic understanding of sex work is bad, it's evil, it's this thing. Then therefore they are disposable because they weren't thought of. Right? And this equation of Black women to this model of like sex work then is directly related to Lonnie Franklin's understanding of a proper masculine subject and denigrates sex work as being something that's evil, which then gets, when you begin to tie the logics to it, begins to denigrate Black women as a whole. This becomes a major issue if these platforms then that are advocating for a proper masculine subjectivity are immersed in that same logic. And then thus you can see why organizing efforts within Black communities who understand that the actual lived experience of Black women is much, much, much different than the sort of what these models portray, then becomes, you have to work against these models, actively work against these models. And, that's a difficult set of logics when you have like all this money that's coming in. But at the same time, I think it has to be something, and this is something that Sarah Haley also, brings up, is that to understand the vital importance of gender and sexuality to the fight against the carceral state is to bring in how, in fact, the manufacturing of a particular type of masculine performance is needed in order to maintain the logics of the carceral state itself.
Yeah, right on. I appreciate that. So I really love this part in the book. There's a brief section where you look at David Walker and Walker's appeal, obviously the appeal, as an embodiment of a Black radical educational, practice, not just a pedagogy, but, you talk about as a, quote, strategic attempt to build Black autonomy, end quote, through education, and how what you call the industrial enclosure model, which we probably should say a little bit about this, sought to enclose or foreclose the radical potentiality of, what we might draw from the appeal as an educational kind of document. So can you talk a little bit about how you're reading Walker here and the potentialities of his radical educational practices?
Yeah, and thanks for this question, because one of the things that I noticed within the field of educational studies is that we're dealing with Black people in the U.S. The field is generally broken into two methods of study, right? You have, on one hand, the theorization around Blackness and race to how Blackness or race operates within the climate of an educational setting, right? And then you have, on the other hand, the historization of Black people's experiences within educational settings. And the latter pretty much lays out the manner in which Black people have engaged with or were pushed out, and still they overcame such tactics to achieve physical freedom in the confines of an educational setting. Now, I would mention as a note, it's interesting enough that many of these type of programs within schools of education are siloed off from the vast majority of courses that teachers and administrators who make up the overwhelmingly majority of students in these programs take. And that's a whole nother note about the purpose of schools of education. But okay, so I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far. But what I found interesting within the former camp is that in many instances, the theorization of radical expressions towards Blackness were and are informed outside of the U.S. context with figures such as Paulo Freire, who is a big figure within the world of ed. And while I have a lot of respect for the work of Freire, I was just struck by how little attention is paid to movements and figures within the United States who are often covered in Black studies, for example, who have an explicit education program as a part of their analysis. And this leads then to focus on a figure like David Walker, for example, who is, to my understanding, is not talked about that much at all in terms of his educational agenda, but then also a theorization of a particular set of Black radical politics. And he's very explicit in the appeal as to what education should be. And I should mention, this is in the 1820s, right? So this is prior to Booker T. Washington. This is prior to like what we think of as like the beginning of Black education. And David Walker is emblematic of just like one figure, but there's a whole bunch of Black radical politics that are set in place in which David Walker comes up within, who are very important to understanding a completely different view of how education should look and be, and important how that view of education is very sort of central to an alternative vision of what the sort of burgeoning country, the United States, should be, right? And in that way, I think a lot about the work of Sonia Borges, who I believe has been on the show as well, to then understand what are the governing ethos of Black liberation projects and what are those sort of non-state-based endorsed projects such as David Walker's Appeal, how that informs a completely different type of vision for what society should look like. And how do we then begin to incorporate these theoretical masterpieces, more or less, into the analysis of, let's say, in the case of education within that discipline. And then getting to the historical aspect of it, which is that in a similar way of thinking about operating outside of the formal school site itself, because so much of the organizing work was being done in the 1960s and 70s by organizations outside of the school, but yet recruiting from the school at the same time, was thinking that something very similar must have been taking place with the sort of the burgeoning formal setup of schools in the 19th century. And so I've been fortunate enough to work with a brilliant scholar at UC Irvine, Mario Rowland, who actually is looking at this very same issue, in which she's looking at how Black women educators in the 19th century developed these robust formations of educational pedagogy that ran counter to the state plans, and what happens once these plans are put into place in different cities across the U.S. And that to me becomes what I hope is an intervention to begin to look at these sources of knowledge production who oftentimes get overlooked within particular sort of fields, to understand their centrality of what should be central to the development of a system or a plan that uses education in a completely different way than what the state does.
No, I appreciate that. So yeah, the last question that I have for you is, one of the things you examine is like sort of these different periods of enclosure for Black education, and we've touched on these along the way, I think, in different ways, but you have, Du Bois and Black Reconstruction and the educational project that goes on there. And then you have a post-Reconstruction enclosure, which I think is probably where you kind of get the beginning of the industrial education enclosure, maybe. Yeah. Right. And then, post Brown versus Board, there's an enclosure of what could be the more radical possibilities of integration, which I appreciated what you said about this in the book too, because you're also, I think, reframing in certain ways the way that, more radical folks would have thought about the potentialities of integration. Obviously, it wasn't just about, integrating schools, right? It was, I think that one of the points you make is that it was about the distribution of resources. And, so there's another enclosure that you kind of document after that as well. I mean, there's more than this. So because you also are talking about some of these enclosures that come out from, the 60s and like Watts and like the Black Power movement and things like that. And then kind of more recently, one of the enclosures you're looking at, is what I might term the sort of educational reform regime that we see really starting with the mid, but more towards the late 90s and early 2000s and into the 2000s, where you get, and I went to school through this because I got out before it got bad, but it was starting to come in when I was in high school. And then by the time I was working in schools, it was set up and it was there, and it was just a thing that you had to deal with. But you have this sort of standardized testing, right? Which for folks who don't know, there really wasn't any standardized testing before the 90s, like not in any kind of, like, you might take one test a year, but it didn't mean anything or whatever. And this happens also alongside charterization, charter schools really becoming a major kind of growing force, these are all connected also to assaults on public education broadly, teachers' unions, etc. And so that's a very rough periodization kind of some of the things that you're looking at throughout this book. And there's a lot of nuance within that you also look at that I'm not really discussing there. And of course, I appreciated you dropped the quote from the Reagan advisor who talked about the educated proletariat we're getting close. What does he say? We're getting dangerously close to an educated proletariat, and that's dynamite or something along those lines. So that's partly looking at California and, again, an enclosure. This is related to the integration point that you're making, but an enclosure of access to what were free universities, essentially, free public universities for Californians. So one of the things I think is really interesting is how all these instances, policy shifts, they represent, a new form of enclosure of more radical possibilities or currents. And I'm interested in thinking about this also in your look at the school to prison pipeline, because this is also a language that gets very much adopted into both the state using it, which is such a weird place for it to be used because it's a total indictment of the state.
Right. Exactly.
But then also within nonprofit foundation, also within prison reform spaces, things like that, right? Is there anything that you want to highlight about these specific enclosures that, I realize we may not have had a chance to talk about all of them throughout the book. And, as we kind of close out, I'm interested in this. I mean, for one, what it does for me always is, and I'm really negative and cynical on this, so people, can feel however they feel about that. But I just feel like policy is such a fraught terrain to try to operate in, because it's always seems to be trying to figure out what do we need to enclose, what do we need to shut down is essentially what policy is. And so even people who try to do, like you said before, the school to prison pipeline, it comes from a kind of radical analysis initially, it gets co-opted, but it's still, most people who use it are very well-meaning folks. They're trying to actually curb mass incarceration a lot of the times. And yet, when these things get into these policy spheres and stuff like that, the way that they get deployed is so often completely different, I guess, than the radical analysis that you started, or even the well-intentions of the people who might be, using it within nonprofit spaces or something like that. So yeah, that's a long-winded question that's not very pointed, but if you have thoughts on it, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think towards the latter, I think it's, I agree with you that I think an argument can be made that the utilization and the implementation of policy as a solution to systemic issues that are at the heart of racial capitalism became the dominant model as a way to dampen the radical efforts that were going on with organizing. And I say that as understanding, because policy and law are linked together, and that there was always understanding. You look through any archive of any organization, and they have a keen understanding that the law is important. You have to know the law, and you have to understand how to work within the confines of the law to achieve certain objectives, but then certain objectives, the majority of them are operating outside of the boundaries of the law. So then how do you achieve those objectives as well? And we got to a place now where primarily through, I think, the emphasis on the nonprofit industrial complex, that the law has become the dominant model through policy formation of understanding how you make quote unquote change, absent of the 75% that it took within organizing to operate it outside of the realm of the law itself, and knowing that you're going to be operating outside of the realm of the law. And so, in certain instances, this becomes absurd when you see organizations who are trying to enact both at the same time, because it's impossible to do so. Either you're going to be acting within the boundaries of the law and you have to understand what strategies to be used, or you're going to be operating outside the boundaries of the law and you have to understand what strategies to be used, right? And so, even within the space of education policy, for example, I think that has become the dominant model because, in a certain extent, it has become the easiest way to co-opt it, because education has become as understood as a normative good. And so ed policy has become an understanding of how actually you change the situation of ed, but this is where I definitely think the organizing efforts on the part of anti-carceral organizations become very helpful, because there's already articulation that, oh, we can't go through policy routes in many respects, because all it's going to do is reify the state. If you take that same logic then and apply it to ed policy, you get a whole different set of solutions that develop. So that's just a brief aside, I think, about policy. With regards to enclosure, and I completely skipped over this because we've been talking about enclosures this whole time, but the greatest influence for me on understanding enclosures is the work of Clyde Woods in his book, Development Arrested, in which he talks about various enclosures that took place within the Mississippi Delta region and this contestation between the plantation block and what he calls the blues block, which is made up of Black working class people in Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arkansas, and how these various form of land closures, culture enclosures get developed in this region and then exported outside to the rest of the country, and in some instances throughout the world as well. And one of the things that Clyde really drives home in that book is the need to understand regions, and why regions are very important, because you really have to understand the context, both the social and political context, but then also understand that one model is not going to fit in every area, and that those regional contexts are very vital. And so I attempted to do that in the book as well, to understand like how it was that certain models get developed and attempted to be exported throughout the rest of the country, such as like the DARE program or the ACT program, which get developed in LA, and why it is that LA is such a central focal point for state suppression as well. So what was happening in LA, where the tentacles of carceral expansion are rooted in many terms of policy formation there, and why is it that they get piloted and tested out in LA? And in many instances, when you look at the radical organizing that was taking place, you can understand as to why this is, because, as an anecdote, you give all these Black Southerners who are coming from all these places together in one place, right? LA and Oakland, and even, in Seattle to a certain extent, who are all together. And so then they are all bringing up these different models that they use as a way to live and survive in these places. And then you just get like a hotbed of both visionary thinking and resistance as well. And so to understand, as your question stated, the periodization as a system of enclosures then very much allow me to understand both the articulation between schools and prisons during various time periods within the U.S., specifically in terms of the formation of education and prisons, but then also within California as well. And that was important to understand the strategies and the reasons and the rationale as to why. And the reason why I bring that up is that the way that schools look right now is completely different than how schools looked in the turn of 20th century. And we have to understand why that is, because oftentimes the way that narrative sort of flows out in a linear historical vantage point is that somehow we've just advanced as a society. And so schools have gotten better and better and more sophisticated. However, when you begin to break that down, instead of looking at it in this linear path and understand that schools are responding to these demands that are being made upon the state by Black communities, then it looks very, very different. And so for me, enclosures become a way to understand the tandem nature of schools and prisons in the United States, right? Which is that the aims and objectives were very similar in terms of suppression of Black communities, and in particular, the suppression of Black labor, the suppression of Black thought, in order to maintain the logics of this imperial project, right? And the framework then places an ethos on understanding what was happening within Black communities, much more so than understanding sort of the heavy-handed nature of the state. And so then, as we look at each of these enclosures, is also to understand that they are building upon each other, but they're attempting to rectify how the previous model may have gone awry in some way. And so, for me, importantly, when thinking about the industrial model of sort of enclosures, often, for those who don't know, I think, a fantastic resource is William Watkins' book, The White Architects of Black Education, in which he lays out the primary objectives of industrial formation of education. At the same time, the governing theorists and philosophers who were at the forefront of what Ori has called psychological warfare, which is to suppress the sort of like the key logics inherent within not just Black radical thought in that sense, but of Blackness itself. So all of that to say is that this industrial model sort of sets the tone for how the logic between private capital and the state is going to be articulated back and forth. And in some instances, these industrialists have direct connections and ties to the expansion of the Carlson apparatus, right? So Andrew Carnegie being the most prominent of these, right? Because Carnegie spent a whole bunch of money to invest within the buildup of Black education, and at the same time reap the benefits of the Carnegie lease system, perhaps greater than any other single capitalist during that time period. And then others, it wasn't so clear as to how their hands were in both pots. However, the ideologies in terms of what we spoke about before of how the state should be crafted ran through their giving of material resources. So when you begin then to use that as a basis to then understand, well, this is how capitalists are thinking, you then can not just stop and look at the policy aspect of it, for example, but then take a step or 2 or 3, 4 steps further to then figure out like, well, who is informing this policy? What interest is being met by this policy? And then you begin to peel back the layers to see what the real aspect of these changes that take place. So how you go from an industrial model to then a model like an integration model to then these various models that takes place, and why it is that these models are being driven in the way that they are. And importantly, which I go back to before, perhaps more importantly, what's happening within Black communities that are forcing the state's hand to then change and make these changes possible. Now, I'll end by saying this, which is that as you mentioned, this most recent model, which is based upon testing to a large extent, is the testing of students for sure, because it comes, as you mentioned, it comes out of this push by sort of right-wing retrograde forces led by, at first, Nixon and Spiro Agnew as the vice president, in order to ensure that Black radicalism stays off of college campuses and high schools as well. But then also with Reagan, when Reagan is governor of the state of California, and that's Roger Freeman is with that famous quote. This is a response to organizations who are using education as a way to grab these resources, as you mentioned. So members of the Black Panther Party are actively recruiting from high schools, as I mentioned before, but then they're also on college campuses like UCLA. And famously, the murder of John Huggins and Bunchy Carter takes place on the campus of UCLA by FBI provocateurs, right? And a testing model becomes put in place as a way to transform who gets access to these resources. At the same time, and this is something I think that's understudied, is that a testing model importantly first gets used on teachers, because teachers, in particular Black teachers, are looked at as being very informative to the development of this set of radical politics as well. So that as this coalesces in tandem, of course, you're going to get attack upon the unions, but us also using these testing models as a way to ensure that you have a set of standards, quote unquote, to both adjudicate teachers and students alike, and then that they become tied to funding regimes. And the very last point that I make about this last model is that, just to understand as anecdote, one of the ways in which the Prop 184, the 3 strikes laws that I mentioned in the beginning, gets repealed in the state is the organizing efforts with abolitionist groups to work with teachers' unions to sort of do the political education work that then informs the sort of the nature and the connections between prisons and public education. So when you come upon the 07-08 crisis in the country and teachers are beginning to get pink slips, immediately the heads of unions are like, well, hold up, how come we're spending all this money on these draconian policies, right? And you can see the effect that unions didn't have, because there's a massive push to organize, in particular through teachers' unions, to undo that policy, which then gets undone shortly thereafter. And that, I think that, if nothing else, lays hold the threat to the state, which is why union busting becomes important to them in the formation of charter schools and expansion of charter schools. On one hand, there's a whole other conversation to be had about land grabs and development, things of that nature. And of course, what happens within the schools. But that aside, you can see at every single turn how these enclosure models are responding to these threats to racial capital.
Yeah, right on. It brings me back. I don't even think I said this to you at the beginning when we were talking off the air, but one of the things for me that was like one of my favorite discussions of kind of the history of the charter movement is the late, great Glenn Ford, this discussion that he did. It was actually, I think he was asked to talk about Cory Booker, and that's sort of like how he got into it, because Cory Booker is a very interesting figure within the history of the charter school movement. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that he then like posits through a lot of great storytelling and analysis and whatnot is that the real impetus behind the charter movement was to drive a wedge within a very, basically he calls it the most progressive voting bloc and organizing bloc within the United States, which was this nexus of teachers' unions and Black communities. And that when those forces combined within cities, that this pushed the most progressive politics within city politics, basically. And that by, on one hand, convincing a lot of folks within the Black community what they need is school choice and they need charter schools, then this becomes an issue that puts them at odds with teachers' unions. And, you know, and so then this starts to break up some of the ways that they can come together and organize. And obviously, there are still ways that people can always come together and organize, but that is, in some ways, on a macro level, that was, and apologies to the late great Glenn Ford because I'm probably misstating it, but that was what one of my key takeaways was from that discussion. I'll link that in the show notes because it is a great conversation. But yeah, I appreciate it so much. I mean, I want to let you go. I think the one thing that as I'm thinking through this whole conversation that I wish that we had talked a little bit more about, which is not, I guess, in some ways, you don't spend quite as much, aside from like kind of the David Walker and some of the other stories along the way, you really are looking at these enclosures and looking at the public education system and how these things are playing out. So I think we've done justice to the book in that respect. But one of the things that you also kind of, I think, conclude out of this is that the radical organizing outside is kind of where it's at in certain ways. For not to say that, I mean, maybe the best way would be the discussion we had at the beginning about music, of understanding that the school might be a site where you build relationships with kids and identify them in certain ways and stuff like that, but that a lot of the important radical education, pedagogical work has to happen outside of these structures as well, because they're so thoroughly, just kind of infiltrated and controlled by these, these carceral logics. And in some ways, I think in that note, the conversation we had about your other book, Against the Carceral Archive, gives an example of what some of those possibilities are, I think. So yeah, I appreciate it. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to say in closing, but this has been great, Damien.
I would say thank you so much once again for the invitation to come on and talk about the book. It's always great to be in dialogue with y'all around these issues. And thank you once again for the wonderful work that you guys have been doing over the past few weeks. It's unfortunate that it's needed, but I'm very much appreciative of the time, energy, and effort that you guys have been putting into making it plain.
Appreciate that, of course. And I look forward to talking to you again. This was great. Really appreciate it. And definitely encourage the book. I mean, all the kind of groups you talked about, I mean, I think it's a great read for educators, people who are interested in educational, policy or research and all of that. But it also is, I think, useful for organizers in a variety of spaces and, abolitionists and just people who want to study kind of like reform and counterinsurgency, because that is a lot of what it's kind of looking at as well within the education sphere. So anyways, much appreciated. Thanks again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.